Hi, this is Phil Parker, and this is podcast number 11 in developing story ideas for the screen. These two stories I want to talk about in this particular podcast are the last two in the group of 10 that really make up all story types. These are The Wanderer and The Character That Can't Be Put Down. Now, in many ways, these are the two most problematic story types in terms of modern contemporary screenwriting theory. The Wanderer is a very modern story type. It's very hard to find any, in fact I've never found any examples pre the industrial age where the Wanderer really works. Most of the stories that exist in earlier societies than that, and earlier written forms, even may be called the Wanderer, but when you analyse the motivation of the character, it's all gift taken away or quest stories. A Wanderer story is something completely different. Here we're looking at a character who arrives in a particular location, a particular identifiable community, and tries to fit in. They want to belong. They want to take their place in this society. And then an event occurs that brings to light a special relationship that they have with the very nature of the society they're in. Something that exposes a difference between them and everyone else. And at this point, you start to understand that this character's desire to fit in is very much about the fact they haven't fitted in before, and therefore their ability to survive in this environment or remain there is actually quite problematic. Now, the nature of this fitting in and the nature of what drives them to keep moving on is very much down to the writer and often a reflection of the very society that they're writing from. The classics of these are obviously great road movies, and there are many of those in the history, ranging from Charlie Chaplin's The Tramp, and more modern era we have things like the Mexican film Y Tu Mama Tambien. Here, in all of these types, we have characters who sort of want to move on and can't settle down, but try so hard to root themselves in a particular time and place. In the 1970s, this led to a whole series of driving movies where characters were driving along long roads, and sometimes you never knew quite why until the very end of the film. Now, in this context, the Wanderer is a very modern character because what it speaks to is a concept of alienation, the fact that people find it very hard to define where they belong. Now, this is one of the great themes which I'll come on to in later podcasts, this idea of how do we actually define who we are. And in this context, The Wanderer is an incredibly useful story type, so long as the writer actually has an idea of what it is they're actually specifically trying to address, rather than just having a character wander about. Alienation is a fine thing, but one can easily be alienated from a story, and therefore a whole narrative, if the audience is actually denied any access to what the writer actually wants to address as a subject, and then what they want to say about it. Now, the final story type is the one that I love most in one regard, and this is because it punches a great hole in that theory that all great movies have to have a character who changes. This story type is the character that cannot be put down. The classic for this throughout modern cinema in many regards has been the Bond character, the character who never changes from one film to the next, and only in the last few years has actually seen any sense of growth whatsoever. And yet, there's been one of the most popular characters of all time in cinema history, and is recognised throughout many, many cultures, regardless of the fact that this is a very particular cultural specific stereotype. So why is it that the character who cannot be put down works? Why is this story motivation so compelling and actually working in mainstream cinema as much as it does in more minor works and very niche films? Because the idea here is that you have a character, a well-defined character, often someone very close to a stereotype. And of course, this actually forces us to recognise straight away that the character who cannot be put down is incredibly well recognised within comedy. The point being here is that your character is not meant to change. That is the whole point of the joke and the fun. They actually confront a world which seeks to change them, and they just carry on. Now, this goes right back to the days of silent comedy, obviously, where characters survive everything thrown at them, right up to the modern-day characters who never fundamentally change, no matter how much chaos they create around them. Now, in this context, characters that can't be put down can be dismissed as just too simplistic, but that dismisses the reality of actually how useful they can be. In many regards, they work fantastically well as antagonists in horror movies, in the sense that the monster just keeps coming and it racks up the tension endlessly until, of course, the final denouement. But in a protagonist, the problem is far more a question of characterization and context. A character who cannot be put down faces a new challenge. You have to create that new challenge fairly up front and straight away so that the audience understands this is the basic motivation going forward. The idea then is that they accept that challenge, don't walk away from it, in other words, and that there are a range of antagonistic forces which they overcome. And this is the point. There is never a single antagonistic force. There's not just one person that they meet scene after scene after scene. And this is why they work so well in Bond, with umpteen double-dealing agents, lots of different fighting groups, until you finally come down to the big confrontation. And this is the nature of the character can't be put down, and has worked in so many action thrillers throughout the last 40, 50 years. It's this idea that a character takes on a number of challenges which grow in order, and ultimately they just keep going until they get to the end of their challenge. And in most cases, of course, we see them succeed, but not always. Now, the point being, though, is they must ultimately get to the end of the challenge. If you sort of veer off at some point, the audience is going to go wonder, well, what happened to that? Is this some sort of version of a quest or something? And many people may say, well, what's the difference between this and the quest? Well, the point about the quest is there is someone seeking to find something. They themselves have chosen to go get it. And they may change in the course of the quest. And the point about the character can't be put down story is that they're given a challenge, not something they sought necessarily, and they agree to take the challenge on, and they're not going to change regardless of what's put in front of them. A radically different approach to character motivation and where the story will take you from a plotting point of view. Of course, this does punch, like I said, a great big hole in the idea that all major stories and all major protagonists must change. But then again, whoever said screenwriting was that simple?